We soon left our camp and took a westward course up the Republican River. Major North, with 2 companies of his Pawnees, and Colonel Royal, with 2 or 3 companies of cavalry, made a scout north of the river. After making camp on the Black-tailed Deer Fork, we observed a band of Indians coming over the prairie at full gallop, singing and yelling and waving their lances and long poles. We first supposed them to be hostile Sioux, and for a few moments all was excitement. But the Pawnees, to our surprise, made no effort to go out to attack them. Presently, they began singing themselves. Major North walked over to General Carr and said, "General, those are our men. They have had a fight, and that is the way they act when they come back from battle with captured scalps." The Pawnees came into camp on the run. We soon learned that they had run across a party of Sioux who were following a big Indian trail. The Sioux had evidently been in a fight. 2 or 3 had been wounded and were being carried by the others. The Pawnees jumped them and killed 3 or 4 of their number. Next morning, our command came up to the Indian trail where the Sioux had been found. We followed it for several days. From the number of campfires we passed, we could see that we were gaining on the Sioux. Wherever they had camped, we found the print of a woman's shoe. This made us all the more eager to overtake them, for it was plain that they had a white woman as their captive. All the best horses were selected by the general, and orders were given for a forced march. The wagon train was to follow as rapidly as possible, while the command pushed on ahead. I was ordered to pick out 5 or 6 of the best Pawnees and proceed in advance of the command, keeping 10 or 12 miles ahead, so that when the Indians were overtaken, we could learn the location of their camp and give the troops the required information in time to plan an effective attack. When we were 10 miles in advance of the regiment, we began to move cautiously. We looked carefully over the summits of the hills before exposing ourselves to observation from the front. At last we made out the village, encamped in the sandhills south of the South Platte River at Summit Springs. Here I left the Pawnees to watch, while I rode back to the command and informed General Carr that the Indians were in sight. The men were immediately ordered to tighten their saddles and otherwise to prepare for action. I changed my horse for old Buckskin Joe. He had been led for me up to this time and was comparatively fresh. Acting on my suggestion, General Carr made a circuit to the north. I knew that if the Indians had scouts, they would naturally watch in the direction whence they had come. When we had passed the camp and were between it and the river, we turned and started back. By this maneuver, we avoided detection by the Sioux scouts. The general kept the command wholly out of sight until within a mile of the village. Then the advance guard was halted till all the soldiers caught up. Orders were issued that at the sound of the charge, the whole command was to rush into the village. As we halted on the summit of the hill overlooking the still unsuspecting Sioux, General Carr called to his bugler, "Sound the charge!" The bugler, in his excitement, forgot the notes of the call. Again the general ordered, "Sound the charge!" and again the musician was unable to obey the command. Quartermaster Hayes, who had obtained permission to join the command, comprehended the plight of the bugler. Rushing up to him, he seized the bugle and sounded the call himself in clear, distinct tones. As the troops rushed forward, he threw the bugle away and, drawing his pistol, was among the first to enter the village. The Indians had just driven up their horses and were preparing to move camp when they saw the soldiers. Many of them jumped on their ponies and, leaving everything behind them, advanced to meet the attack. On second thought, however, they decided it would be useless to resist. Those who were mounted rode away, while those on foot fled for the neighboring hills. We charged through their village, shooting right and left at everything we saw. Pawnees, officers, and regular soldiers were all mixed together, while the Sioux went flying away in every direction. The general had instructed the soldiers to keep a sharp lookout for white women when they entered the village. 2 were soon found. One of them was wounded, and the other had just been killed. Both were Swedes, and the survivor could not speak English. A Swedish soldier was soon found to act as interpreter. The woman's name was Weichel. She said that as soon as the Indians saw the troops coming, a squaw, the wife of Tall Bull, had killed Mrs. Allardyce, her companion in captivity, with a hatchet. The infuriated squaw had attacked Mrs. Weichel, wounding her as well. The purpose of the squaw was apparently to prevent both women from telling the soldiers how cruelly they had been treated. The attack lasted but a little while. The Indians were driven several miles away. The soldiers gathered in the herd of Indian horses, which was running wild over the prairie, and drove the animals back into camp. After a survey of our work, we found that we had killed about 140 Indians and captured 120 squaws and papooses, 200 lodges, and 800 horses and mules. General Carr ordered that all the teepees, lodges, buffalo robes, camp equipage, and provisions, including a large quantity of buffalo meat, should be gathered and burned. Mrs. Allardyce, the murdered Swedish captive, was buried. Captain Kane read the burial service, as we had no chaplain with us. While this was going on, the Sioux warriors recovered from their panic and came back to give us battle. All around the attack, a fight began. I was on the skirmish line and noticed an Indian who was riding a large bay horse and giving orders to his men in his own language. I could understand part of what he said. He was telling them that they had lost everything and were ruined, and was entreating them to follow him until they died. The horse this chief was riding was extremely fleet. I determined to capture him if possible, but I was afraid to fire at the rider lest I kill the horse. Often, the Indian, as he rode around the skirmish line, passed the head of a ravine, and it occurred to me that if I dismounted and crept up the ravine, I could, as he passed, easily drop him from the saddle with no fear of hitting the horse. Accordingly, I crept into the ravine and secreted myself there to wait till Mr. Chief came riding by. When he was not more than 30 yards away, I fired. The next instant, he tumbled from the saddle, and the horse kept on his way without a rider. Instead of running back to the Indians, he galloped toward the soldiers, by one of whom he was caught. Lieutenant Mason, who had been very conspicuous in the fight and had killed 2 or 3 Indians himself, came galloping up the ravine, and jumping from his horse, secured the elaborate war bonnet from the head of the dead chief, together with all his other accoutrements. We both rejoined the soldiers. I started in search of the horse and found him in the possession of Sergeant McGrath, who had captured him. Now McGrath knew that I had been trying to get the horse, and he saw me kill its rider, so he handed the animal over to me at once. I little thought at the time that I had captured the fastest running horse west of the Missouri River, but this later proved to be the fact. Late that evening, our wagon train arrived. Mrs. Weichel, the wounded woman, had been carefully attended by the surgeons, and we placed her in the ambulance. Gathering up the prisoners, squaws, and papooses, we set out for the South Platte River, 8 miles distant, where we went into camp. Next morning, by order of General Carr, all the money found in the village was turned over to the adjutant. Above $2,000 was collected, and the entire amount was given to Mrs. Weichel. Her former husband had been killed by the Indians. Our prisoners were sent to the Whetstone Agency on the Missouri, where Spotted Tail and the friendly Sioux were then living. The captured horses and the mules were distributed among the officers and soldiers. Among the animals which I thus obtained were my Tall Bull horse and a pony which I called Powder Face. This animal figured afterward in the stories of Ned Buntline and became famous. William F. Cody.